All right, welcome back, y'all. This is going to be the start of Unit 3, so we have 4 chapters. Chapter 12 is going to be on connectivity, communications, and technology. I'm going to go a little bit more off script as we start to move forward. We're kind of past the basics a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit more of my own stuff and kind of move away from the textbook a little bit, though, please read the textbook. Okay, chapter 12 is by Andreas Hagman. This is where we start to really talk about sort of globalization and interconnectedness. And a lot of this, I would say, falls a little bit more into the realm of liberalism than it does realism. Realism is about the anarchic system, developing power for your own state, these sorts of things. This sort of globalization and interconnectivity piece is a lot more along the lines of liberalism, democratic peace, things of that sort. Okay, so basically, we want to ask how is the internet influencing modern politics? And I have a bunch here to talk about. Since COVID times, we've gotten a lot more sort of work from home, right? This was not only for safety purposes, um, but we started to find out that the labor market was incredibly hot during, at least after the shutdowns were dismissed. And so the labor market was incredibly hot. This led companies to sort of continue their policies of work at home. Right now, as the labor market weakens and unemployment rates start to increase, we're at about 4.3% as of right now, which is the highest we've had in a long time. So the Fed dropped rates, but it has also meant that a lot of companies are starting to call back, saying we are no longer going to allow sort of work from home, flex schedules, whatever you might want to call it, because the housing market is, not the housing market, the labor market is not nearly as hot as it used to be. So companies don't have to have sort of give these things away anymore. Um, and work from home had its good and its bad. It helped with things like childcare. It helped with women employment, things like that. So it was a mixed bag. Okay. The next point I'd like to make is controlling the narrative, right? This hasn't always been easy, but during the sort of internet age, social media, etc., some states on Earth are starting to push this sort of control of the narrative. So I think China is a great example and sort of led the charge on this. Their internet blockages and rules, etc., are sort of widely known as the Great Firewall of China. And I would also say that China has innovated in weird ways through things like social monitoring, massive, camera programs all over not only urban areas but rural areas, city centers, etc. Um, they have helped WeChat, which is a very, very famous Chinese app, to basically control much of daily life in China. So you can pay your bills on it. You can order a taxi or an Uber. You can do your internet shopping. You can do all kinds of things, pay your utilities, all kinds of stuff through this singular app, which allows them stronger monitoring. And then I would also say that countries like Hungary and Russia are pushing more in this direction. Russia is really starting to implement some of these internet protocols, limiting what you can get into, making you sort of route through their own government-owned servers, etc. And so we'll see how that moves forward in the future. Another topic I wanted to bring up was sort of contemporary revolutions and civil wars. The Arab Spring, which I'm pretty sure we've talked about in this course before, is a really good example where uh, revolutions and civil wars used to take many months or years to sort of foment. to pass information around, these sorts of things. Well, now it's rather instantaneous, right? The Arab Spring happened in a week or two because of mass social media usage, the ability to coordinate protests and things of that sort, the sharing of information and videos over these apps, etc. And the Arab Spring has also led to things like mass migration, exploitation by human traffickers, um, things of this sort. Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up, because we'll talk about terrorism in a future chapter, which is another topic sort of related to internet and contemporary international politics, but I'll leave that one aside for now, is the rise of far right politics across the United States and even Europe. So we're seeing sort of far right politics rise, whether this be sort of white supremacy or neo Nazism or things of that sort. Even in surprising places like Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, and of course the United States. Right? We had the Charlotte protests or riots or whatever you might want to call them a few years back. So this is a rising phenomenon in the United States as well. The next section, section 3, is about digital commerce. And one of the questions for this week's topic is about sort of comparative advantage. You know, globalization has allowed for the mix of globalization and neoliberalism have sort of allowed for a hyper extension of Ricardo's comparative advantage theories. But this hasn't necessarily been equally beneficial for everyone, right? Yes, it helps with GDP. Yes, it helps bring in cheaper products when you're manufacturing them at very low costs in other countries. But it has also led to the loss of sort of manufacturing jobs in the United States, especially across, what we call the Rust Belt, and sort of hollowing out of the middle class, right? As we get basically the super wealthy versus the service economy in the United States. So these things have far-reaching and mixed results, right? Okay, we'll skip all the way down to section 8 about control. And we kind of talked about this before, but this is a growing movement in international politics, right? I think I mentioned last time when I talked about David Ricardo and his comparative advantage. He talked about sort of the three classifications that a country needs to be concerned about, right? Land, labor, and capital, and you should take advantage of whichever one you have the most efficient production of. But China has basically declared in the last 10 to 15 years that data should be added to as sort of the fourth classification. And so they're really trying to lead the way when it comes to things like data. And this has led to some political fights, right, between China and Europe and the United States, where Europe and the the EU and the US have really moved to limit China's access to American data. So we've seen fights over 5G and 5G technology and the disallowing of China to implement these 5G programs in the United States and in Europe. We've seen the onshoring of data centers, right? And this is part of the sort of contemporary fight between China and Trump over TikTok. Is the concern that China is going to use this data to learn, to gain a strategic foothold over the United States. And so they want to be able to keep the data in America where China cannot have access to it, right? And then finally, I wanted to add my own section here that kind of gets away from all the stuff they talked about in the chapter. And a lot of this has to do with sort of warfare, right? I don't think that they touched really in any way on the internet and warfare and the advances that we are making. But we know that satellites and the internet are vital to contemporary warfare. We're seeing this in places like Ukraine, right, where there are denial of service attacks on the Ukrainian infrastructure for things like internet, electricity, etc. Um, GPS is absolutely vital to modern warfare. And if you can cut off internet access and things like GPS, it becomes much more difficult on the ground to operate. We're also seeing the rise in things like drone usage in warfare, right? And there have been vast improvements in drone strategy, in drone technology, in efficiency of drones, in creating cheap platforms, all of these sorts of things, right? And I would argue actually that the US is pretty far behind on this sort of stuff. Um, but I'm going to leave that up to you. That's another one of our questions for the week. And then we also have things like cyber attacks on banking and infrastructure. So we've seen this happen in Lithuania, Ukraine, Moldova. There have been numerous attacks on things like infrastructure, like water programs, electrical grids, etc. And for the most part, from what we know, China, Russia, Iran, and the United States are the main culprits here. Um, okay, so I'll leave it there. I'm going to try to get all the lectures up tonight and the questions. Thanks for being here and have a great day.